All right. All right. Looks like we're in. So
I guess I'll start.
I say it's up to you if you want to start, or I can start.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Life, the Complete Story. Uh, we are Tyler and Alex, two young, aspiring biologists uh, who want to kind of share taxonomy with you guys. Taxonomy is the breakdown of where things kind of fall in line on how they're related to each other in the animal in the natural world. So we'll go over a little bit of that later on. I'll
Yeah.
send it over to Alex, and he can give a little bit about himself.
Yeah. So kind of a little bit of background about both of us. We both known each other for a long time, been best friends for years. We both went to college for biology, southwestern Pennsylvania in the United States. Waynesburg University is where we went. But both growing up loved nature and being outside and learning about it. So we decided bef- and now is a good enough time as any to kind of share our love with everyone else. So, like I said, we both went to school for biology. I, by trade, I'm in forestry. I'm a certified forester through the ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture, um, mostly in the utility vegetation management side, as well as being a certified pesticide applicator through the state of Pennsylvania. Tyler, if you want to share a little bit about kind of where you're at in your biology career.
Right. So I don't get to handle the living world as often as I want to. I am actually by trade a soil and water technician in a laboratory, but it hasn't stopped me from loving animals for the past 20 something years
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to go more in depth on how everything relates to each other. So what we're going to start
Yeah.
first with today is an article from CNN on an expedition off the coast of New Zealand.
Yeah, it's discovered 100 potential new species and deep sea species. Some of them, if they say a number of them are new to science. Some of them are just they haven't seen them. They see them very rarely because they are deep sea species.
Right. So a little breakdown on this article. Obviously, as we said, over 100 new potential species, but
Yeah.
they have confirmed three of them, like right off the bat of whenever they came up from the trawls. So, Alex, if you want to explain like how they did these tests.
Yeah. So a lot of that had to do with you get down through here. Kind of said that deep sea, 3 mile as far as 3 miles. So that's 4,800 or 4,800 meters for our non-American folks. That's pretty far. That's was it every 30 feet is another atmosphere of pressure. So
It's a
that's a
lot of
pretty
pressure.
yeah, it's a pretty significant amount of pressure. They did some deep sea diving, collecting samples of many different things: fish, squid, mollusk, coral, any other species they found. I'm sure they did some soil sampling and things like that as well. They said that was in April last year, 2023. About 100,000 unknown species they're aiming to identify within the next 10 years. So they'll be busy for a while. Some of them they're almost certain that they're brand new, like that. They said that species of octocoral, which actually could be an entire new genera, not just a new species, which would be really cool,
Right.
very interesting.
Yeah. So, how they do these testing is they kind of have these big, like, sleds that have like a net on the back of them, and they run these sleds on the sea floor. They have like their normal one that they do on like the sandy floor.
Mm-hmm.
They have a more rugged net that they use for the rockier surfaces. And then they have a third sled that doesn't touch the ground per se, but it kind of just hovers above and collects like more of the fish that would be preying on like the detritus and all the sea snow.
Yeah, the things that are actually on the ground. It's like that next layer, like not on the ground, but like close to the ground layer.
Right.
Yeah, and this said in the article here, one of the scientists said finding new vertebrates is rare. Um, There's hundreds of thousands of invertebrate in the sea that we don't know about, but vertebrates it's even more rare. Which I mean makes sense. It's a smaller compared to the invertebrate animals. It's a smaller comparatively um,
Right. As we'll go over later
group.
on,
Yeah,
there's
as we go
about
over.
8 phyla of invertebrates compared to the 1 phyla of vertebrates.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just astronomically more species. But what Alex is referring to is they've identified these two potentially new species of eelpout, which is a type of fish, especially found deep, deep underwater. But that's the gist of this article. We'll
Yeah,
move
just
on
kind
to
of
our
a quick overview. So now that kind of leads us into kind of what we're starting with today. As we said, we're going to go through the taxonomic tree, kind of going through, like we said, what is life as a life, the complete story, kind of what the different classifications of life. As many people know, you see people, pets like dogs, cats, large, large vertebrate animals, as well as things like small invertebrates that you think of, like ants, flies, things like that, as well as plants. But there's people don't realize how diverse, in a lot of cases say, oh, it's a plant, not, oh, that's a gymnosperm tree, like a pine tree versus a maple tree, oak tree, or different animals like your ants, ants, all the different thousands of species or whatever it is of ants around the
right.
world.
There's the largest species is the beetle, and there's hundreds of thousands of just beetles around the
Mm-hmm.
world.
Yeah, yeah. So we're kind of starting off with like what is life, like your fact characteristics of life. Of course, yeah, like we say, what makes something alive? Starting off, or they're made of one or more cells, so it needs to be made of actual cells. If you took a high school or even younger than that, middle school biology class, you went through the kind of what is a cell. That's that most basic unit of life. There's billions of single-celled organisms, bacteria, single-celled eukaryotic cells, which we'll get into a little later on, like amoeba, um, things like that. Kind of. So they have that basic. Yeah, here you go.
Yeah,
From
so
technology networks, cell science, a picture
the
here.
cell on the left for our video listeners, that's going to be a eukaryotic cell. What makes it a eukaryotic cell is it has this center nucleus, this kind of blue tennis ball found in the middle, and it has these uh, membrane-bound organelles. So these uh, endoplasmic reticulum, these mitochondria, these ribosomes floating around.
It's the powerhouse of the cell.
Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Um,
I had to.
and anything like that. Plant cells have obviously chloroplast and a cell wall. That's kind of what differentiates them from animal cells. We'll go into that at a later time down the road when we go more in depth into plants.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and obviously on the right side of this little picture is a prokaryotic cell, a lot more basic in terms of their setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Most of the time it's just what like a little clump of of DNA RNA.
Yeah, they call it like the nucleo. I don't remember what the technical term for it is off the top of my head. Like the nucleolus, I think is what they. No, that's in the eukaryotic cell. That's like a hard clump of DNA in the center. But that like
Yeah.
there's just and the DNA is much simpler. Usually just a couple little rings in a prokaryotic cell, just kind of a clump of it there in the cell, and that's like the ribosomes, your RNA is just running. It just runs right there. It's all out in the open. That's why bacteria are so much more prone to genetic mutation is because it's just wide open, and if something gets into the cell, doesn't kill it, it's super easy for it to mutate, change to the DNA.
Right. There's no storage. There's no shelving. There's no
Yeah, it's not
cabinetry in the
protect. It's
shell.
yeah. There's no like capsule that protects the DNA that
Right.
only very few things are able to get in and out of.
So that's the most basic form of, oh, well, how is it alive or how is it, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
abiotic.
yeah. Like viruses, we talk a lot about. When you talk about viruses like the flu, things like that, they're not alive. They don't. They're not. That's a thing we'll get into a little later as we get into go through a couple more of the things of what makes something alive, um, like the grow and reproduce. Like viruses, they're able to grow and reproduce, but they actually uh, they're parasitic.
Yeah,
They
they have
use
to use something else to
yeah, they
do it.
don't
They
have
can't
their
do it
own
naturally on their own.
yeah. Yeah, like living cells are able to divide and reproduce on their own. Now, of course, there's things that are still parasitic, but they don't require necessarily. There's some cases they use different hosts for different parts of the life cycle, but like the host cell isn't the one that's manufacturing the new organism. It makes it itself. It just feeds off of that host. Um, Respond to stimuli in their environment as well as maintaining a stable internal environment, which is referred to as homeostasis. Those are two more things that kind of think of yourself as a human. Uh, you respond to the world around you as things happen to you, as well as that internal environment, your body temperature, you're hungry, thirsty. It's trying to maintain those levels within the body to uh, keep that kind of within that range of what is like that middle happy place that your body likes to be. And then the
Right.
last thing, which we'll talk much more in depth as we get into our classifications, is you need energy to stay alive, which you get into. There's typically producers and consumers are like the two big categories of that. If you want to explain what that
Yeah,
kicks into.
obviously a producer in terms of this natural world we have is anything that, gets their energy directly from the sun or through there's a little subgroup that use what is the term? Chemo.
Yeah, yeah, like chemosynthesis, where like
Yeah,
deep sea bacteria that grow near volcanic vents, they actually feed off of the sulfur compounds and things like that
right.
within the chemicals that come out of those vents to produce.
And
They
that's
don't need
actually
sunlight.
that kind of refers back to the article we talked about earlier, the opening article we had where, we're finding all these new species of invertebrate and all these found deep below the sea. Well, light doesn't get the whole way down there, 3 miles
No.
deep under the sea. So there's no way to photosynthesize. So you're having to rely on either these steam vents, these methane vents found underwater that have their own entirely unique ecosystems, or
Hmm.
you're having to rely on the ocean snow, as I call it, all the dead fish particles, whatever, that kind of like shimmy their way down the ocean floor as they get eaten by the higher tier predators up on the open ocean or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part of why deep sea exploration. We have don't even we've explored the moon more than we've explored the deepest parts of Earth's oceans, because it's difficult. The pressures make it extremely difficult to get down there and work. It's hard on machinery, equipment, as well as try to go down there in manned vehicles. You have to build like a capsule to be able to withstand the pressures and not. It's a harder when you can't just make everything like a solid ball or it's solid metal. You have to be able to have that space inside, the pressure inside to balance it out. Um, so it's super cool. There's always new findings. Even the rainforest as well brings a lot of that biodiversity.
Right.
Makes it super interesting. So now
But
is a
but for the for
okay.
for the simplicity of our little demonstration, we will refer to producers in this sense as things that get their energy from the sun, mostly plants and algae, because
Yeah,
that's the simplest way to explain it. Is things that
yeah.
get
Things that
uh
make their own energy. They don't
yeah,
have to eat something else to
right.
get energy.
Which would lead us to our consumers, and Alex and I are consumers. You, the listener, are a consumer. Many things are consumers. Basically, the entire animal world and the fungal world, and 90% of the prokaryotes in the world are um, consumers. They
Yeah.
they need to rely on something else to get their nutritional value, whether it be the producers or the things that eat the producers. And you have this energy pyramid that you may have learned about in your high
Hmm.
school level biology class, where the
Yeah.
producers are the base and they start, and that's where most of the energy is produced. And as you go further up this pyramid, say the bugs eat the grass, and then
Hmm.
the birds eat the bugs, and the cats eat the birds, and then you have this pyramid. Uh, Energy is lost throughout this pyramid, meaning that
Yeah, the trophic pyramid
right,
is what is referred to. Yeah, usually you don't get past a tertiary or like that third level consumer. There's very rarely a quaternary, like a fourth level consumer. Usually, um, it stops at three. And if you think like your plants, like mice eat plants, and oh, like a weasel or something eats the mouse, and then a hawk eats the weasel or something like
right,
something like that. That hawk's that third level consumer. And usually, you don't get too far past that. You'd see a quaternary consumer more in aquatic biomes than you would in terrestrial, just
right,
because of the nature of availability of food
right.
in that
That's
sense.
that's exactly what I was going to go to next. Is the as you go up the pyramid, there are less and less of the things to feed on because they require more energy than the level before them.
Mm. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so with that, that kind of is our five main points on what makes something biotic or living versus abiotic, non-living. And we're going to go into our next topic for the day, which is kind of the classification of this all and how we as humans have kind of devised a method to organize what's close to each other in terms of physiological features like how their bone structures are similar versus or um, you know ancient ancestors even.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where that classification, when we talked about taxonomy at the beginning, this is what we're referring to, this classification of living things. Um, so when you and I were growing up, taking biology classes in school, we learned the classification system. There's different levels. Start the lowest is species, so like humans were Homo sapiens. Sapiens is the species name in the genus, which is your next level up. Homo, which in the past included all the other human-like
Right.
species, like the Neanderthals and the other. They
Homo
found more,
erectus, things
yeah.
like that.
And then going up from there, you get your family, then or family, order, class, phylum, then kingdom. So those have been fairly consistent throughout the years. But when you and I were going through school, the level above kingdom was called the domains, which we learned there were three, which is the bacteria, archaea, or in the past called the archaebacteria, which they're a little different. They're actually closer to they're different in the sense that like they have um, traits from both the bacteria, like they're considered prokaryotic cells,
Right.
but
They're kind of like this transitional species, we'll
yes.
say, between a bacteria and a eukaryote. They
Mm.
show some similarities, but they aren't correct considered one or the other. So they're kind of in the middle.
Yeah, and a
Um,
lot of them are actually fall into the category of extremophiles. Like they found them in the vents at Yellowstone, like that are the sulfur vents, or deep down in the ocean, or in high on mountaintops. Or super low oxygen, it's very cold. They found these
right.
organisms in
And
those
that's
different
kind of how
places.
I remember being taught
Hmm.
early on in my biological education was there's archaea and they're basically bacteria, but they do things in a they like it hot or they like it cold or
Hmm.
something like that where it's
They love the extremes where
yeah,
not much
there's
else
no middle
lives.
ground for them.
Hmm. Yeah, and then of course the last domain that we learned was eukarya, which is the eukaryotic cells. But now, most recently, and I pulled up the article here, it's called a higher level classification of all living things, which is uh, Michael A. Ruggiero and a number of others: Dennis Gordon, Thomas Orrell, Nicholas Bailey, Thierry Burgoyne. I apologize if I mess up any names. Richard Brusca, Thomas Cavalier Smith. Michael Geary and Paul Kirk are the authors listed on this article. And this, they have it classified as super kingdoms rather than domains. And I think that's the more recent, actually, that Thomas Cavalier Smith was one of the ones on the researchers that came up with the three domain system, or they helped kind of propagate that, I should say. I don't think they were originally came up with it. They might have. I haven't researched super closely into that, but the most recent, kind of what's now the more used system, is the two super kingdom system, which is like a two domain kingdom or a kind of tree, which so it goes into prokaryota, which is your bacteria and archaea, and then eukaryota, which is all the eukaryotic cells that uh, have that more complex life style.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So as we kind of progress, now we're going back down the tree as we kind of elaborate on what each of these are. We gave the rundown of, we're Homo sapiens, species sapien, genus Homo. We're kind of going to run down and like we start with the super kingdom or the domains. Now we're kind of going to go into the kingdoms, explain what makes a kingdom a kingdom. So we're gonna now the kingdoms are the prokaryotes have the bacteria and the archaea, correct, Alex?
I believe the archaean
Uh,
bacteria are separate when you get to the kingdom level. So,
okay, so they're separate
yeah,
kingdoms.
so your archaea or archaebacteria are a kingdom within themselves. And then the bacteria or eubacteria, like the EU prefix meaning true bacteria, um, those, and then those get broken down into your gram positive and gram negative, and that's something we'll get a little more into when we get to the bacteria. That has some to do with a scientific uh, way of classification. It has to do with the outer coating on the
Right,
bacteria, and when you do gram staining, if you've ever had a chance to take a sort of like microbiology class, you would do some of that. The different bacteria stain different colors under a microscope when you use the different dyes, and that's because of those different outer coatings.
right. Whether or not they show the proteins that make it a gram positive or a gram negative cell.
Yeah.
But as we go into the domain eukarya or the super kingdom eukarya, however you
Hmm.
choose to call it,
Yeah.
um, there are three kingdoms for eukaryotes, correct?
Five, I think. Actually,
Five.
they've broken it down further. The protozoa, which is kind of the all-encompassing, like fills in a lot of the single-celled eukaryotic organisms, like your
Your
diatoms,
amoebas.
amoeba. Then chromista, which that one's newer. I think a separation from protozoa. I'm not sure what all fits into that. That's obviously we'll learn as we go through these. You and I will learn as well. As we get into that. And then of course your fungi, which is your different types of fungi, whether they have the large fruiting bodies like your mushrooms, your lichens are kind of fall into the fungi, I believe, um, and all that goes into plant which is your plants, so your trees, grasses, bushes, everything that goes with that. Pretty much all the green growing plants that you would see um, either on the ground or even underwater, like your kelps, your seagrasses, things like that. Pretty much anything they have, they're a little different from your uh, like producing protozoans as well as obviously as well as bacteria, but especially the producing protozoans. They tend to be in those uh, larger organisms that actually are able to be broken down beyond the organism level into like the single celled organisms. You just have your organelles, which are like mini organs within the cells. But those larger organisms, you have the different cells make up specific tissues which are able to specialize within the organ. They don't have one cell that does everything for life. Um, to keep like that's the whole organism.
Right.
So those
I've
bigger
found a
ones.
little article from the National Center for Biotechnology Information
Okay.
on what is the kingdom chromista. If you'd like
Okay.
me to
Yeah.
go into it,
Absolutely.
um, this is an article by Thomas Cavalier Smith.
Okay.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Um, So it says that Chromista is one of 5 eukaryotic kingdoms recognized in a comprehensive 7 kingdom classification of life. As here critically reassessed, Chromista comprises 8 distinctive phyla, not just 3, as in the first substantial systematic treatment 30 years ago in the Cavalier Smith article.
Hmm.
5 years after Chromista was established, Chromista have turned out to include the vast majority of marine algae and of heterotrophic protists,
Okay.
whether marine or in soil or fresh water, and some of the most serious human disease agents such as malaria and agricultural pathogens like potato blight and sugar beet rhizomania disease.
Okay. Wow. So it's a kind of a break off of the protozoan kingdom. It's like a more specialized. Sounds like it's like uh your your different algae as well as some.
Right. It seems to include a lot of the diatoms.
Okay.
Uh, for foraminifera, which I'm not quite sure what that entails. I can
Hmm.
do a quick little Google search if I will, but yeah, that seems to be there another kind of branch of the single cell organisms
Okay.
along with the protozoans.
Nice, nice. Very cool. And then as well, for continuing our last kingdom that we're getting into is of course Animalia, which most everyone is familiar with. Those are your like humans, your dogs, cats, fish, whales, deer, everything that pretty much runs or crawls or flies is
And even some sedentary things,
even
like
some more sedentary things.
sponges and
Yes,
coils. Those
yeah,
are animals.
they
News
are.
to me too, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. When we first learned, you think they kind of are their own group, but they fall under animals because the polyps are small. That like when you see especially the coral bodies that you see are from millions and billions of little teeny tiny polyps, which are almost like upside down uh, jellyfish kind of looking
Right.
dudes, where
Where
they
they have the bulb at the bottom, like how a
mhm,
jellyfish is on top, and they kind of have these little tiny little, especially coral, because they're so small and they make these big social organisms.
mhm.
Um, and that's how they feed is with these little nettles.
Yeah, and the coral body that you see is just the buildup over time of the little casings that the corals create. Um,
as
it's like
they
yeah, it's like a little
create new ones.
calcified structure
Right.
that goes into. So then, yeah, so those are the kingdoms, and I think going forward, I think we're going to start in Animalia just because it's one that a lot of people are more familiar
Yeah,
with. It's an
it's the
easy, it's
most
the easier,
popular. It's the easiest to explain,
yeah.
and it honestly probably has the least amount of topic to cover.
Yeah, or at least in depth, I should.
In depth,
Yeah,
right?
like you
There's
don't. We don't need to get quite so. It's not going to take quite as much time to get through all of Animalia as it will Plantae, and especially once we get into like fungi and protists, it's
right.
going to get crazy.
Yeah, it's gonna get super, not super complicated, but it requires some more in-depth
Hmm.
explanation on things that
Absolutely.
us giving you guys a background and a little bit of like, oh, how do you compare this to something else? Well, the animal kingdom is gonna be our like benchmark, we'll say,
Yeah.
for how we're gonna compare these things to.
Yeah, and then of course going down, you get phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Mostly, we're going to stay. We're not going to get much further below the family level, just because you start getting, if you start going species by species, it gets you're starting to get into some more minute details in some
Right,
cases, as well as that like those families are that overarching. Like this is what like families you start getting into like the cats, like what makes something a cat versus like a
right.
canine. Um, and then in the plants, like the
The,
root.
the the vast majority of these differences we're going to cover on these animals is really found in the family division. Like
Hmm.
um, the order's too broad, we'll say, and the genus is too specific.
Yeah.
Like differences between genuses in the same family might be as simple as, oh well, this one has uh, a more this genus has more curved teeth than straight teeth, even though they're both felines,
Hmm.
feliniforms.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like in the plants, this genus has leaves of this shape versus this shape, or the bark is this way. Kind of, it gets a little more specific than what we're looking at least for now. Now, of course, if listeners would like to hear more specifically about a certain thing, we can start kind of highlighting if there's a real popular species or genus that
Right.
people
Not.
want to hear about. We could do some highlights, but
I
that's
think
not
we
the
have that
main
general
focus.
idea. I think we have that general idea of, okay, when we get to when we get to the family, we're gonna be like, well, here's what genus exists in it, and if you guys as listeners like enjoy a genus, like you know of a genus that you want us to talk about more in depth, we can highlight that in a special episode, or we're probably gonna give a little highlight on, depending on the genus, depending on the family, like 3 or 4, like maybe one species from each genus in that family to highlight that are like super amazing, have something unique about them that's not just like, you know, something simple as, oh well, it has like two high like no kneecaps versus the other one that has kneecaps or something stupid like that.
Yeah, yeah,
Also,
absolutely. So
elephants don't have kneecaps,
no, they don't.
and that's why they can't jump.
Other than the fact that they're like many, many
Yeah,
thousands of
yeah, thousands of pounds
yeah,
heavy, and they're on terrestrial land.
yeah, they're just huge.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, so that kind of what looking forward. That's kind of where we're getting into. As far as how what we're going to look at for each episode, kind of going through different families. We get one or two, depending on how jam packed it is with information. However many we get through in each episode is however many we get through, but we're just going to work through the phylogenetic tree that way. Um, so yeah, that is very cool. So now I think we'll move on. Since as we were saying, that kind of that species we're looking at, we're going to go through. We're going to have a small little segment where we go through an amazing species from the IUCN Red List, which he can explain what that is, Tyler.
Right. So the IUCN is the, oh boy, International Union for Conservation of Nature, and annually, I'll say, they go out and they kind of take um, surveys of a whole bunch of different species. They don't do every species every single year because that would be insane.
It'd be almost
There's
just they would never get past the insects.
right, exactly. So what they do is they have their red list, and this is a um, kind of a database where they have a lot of different species that they've already done this survey on or consistently doing these surveys on. And obviously, um, depending on, I'll explain that this is their endangered species list. This is the International Endangered Species List where they keep track of plants, animals, and I don't believe they do fungi, but they're mostly plants and animals. And they kind of do your um vulnerable, threatened, near threatened, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild. Um,
Yeah, I think fungi is one of the few groups that they don't do.
right.
Yeah,
Um, so they kind of explain. Uh, they highlight a whole bunch of species as their amazing species. And what I'm going to do as this program progresses is I will highlight one each episode, and kind of explain what it is, why it's endangered, what are we doing as a human population to kind of keep them around because a lot of these species really are truly amazing and have a lot of good to provide. So for today's amazing species, if I could spell, is going to be the Yang's giant soft-shelled turtle, which is a large turtle
yeah,
found.
yeah. Scientific name, Raphitus swinjoi. I believe it sounds like it's most likely the American or the English version of a Chinese name.
Yeah,
And as far as yeah, the scientific names go through your that's the genus and the species of the animal is how like when you hear the scientific name of a specific species, that's what that refers to is the genus and specific species name, which is sometimes called the specific epithet. And that's just the way that it's written out, of course. So just for a quick little
right.
the genus name is capitalized and the species name is in lowercase unless it's a specific person's name, which you'll get like some subspecies or different things after the species name in some cases.
Yeah,
And of course,
maybe
that's
a specific cultivar of a plant,
yeah,
or a
different
not a
variety.
hybridization, but a
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes
Yeah.
hybridizations. And that's either italicized if you're typing it out, or if you're handwriting it, you can underline it. Um, so
But yeah, so
just a little
this is the
bioclass
genus
fact.
Raphitus, correct?
Yes.
Raphitus is a genus of endangered softshell turtles, obviously,
Hmm.
because we're talking about giant softshell turtle and its amazing species on the IUCN Red List. They are critically endangered, this specific species. The last IUCN Red List publication for it had 3 adult individuals left in the wild, which is not a lot.
Yeah, that
Not a
is
lot.
bad.
Um, but more recently, the numbers figure closer to 2. Um,
Yeah, that not
not
good.
not to say that they don't exist in more numbers, but in the surveys they did, the most recent survey was 2018, 12 March 2018. In the year 2021, they had 3 mature individuals with a
Okay.
decreasing population.
And that is specifically. Do they know if they were male, female? Is it three males? Like,
Um, well, when I did my research on this species, they were all females that they found in the
oh,
wild.
that's
They have a captive one, which is a male, but
mm,
he is unable to reproduce.
he's not doing good.
So the best hope is to use some sort of artificial fertilization on these captive species to try and figure something out to bring them to bring a more stable population back.
Hmm.
But these are found obviously in the Yangtze River in China, more closer towards that eastern coast around Shanghai.
Okay,
Um,
down towards like
Notoriously,
Vietnam.
yes, and they have a range towards Hanoi, Vietnam, but that is a possibly extinct region.
Okay.
Um, Actually, I'm reading this chart wrong. I will give me 1 second, guys. For our visual listeners, we have a map here for you guys where the red highlighted region around Shanghai is actually an extinct region where it used to be but is no
Mm,
longer.
okay.
In Hanoi, you have these stripes, which is possibly extinct. So this was also an extant range.
Yeah.
Um,
So that little yellow dot
this little yellow dot right
is where
here,
they confirmed individuals.
where
So
the last 3 individuals
yeah.
were spotted, in this little tiny dot on in Vietnam.
Hmm.
So notoriously, the Yangtze River is disgusting,
Yeah.
an absolute
Really
trash pit,
polluted.
really polluted. Um, yeah, China is much overpopulated, correct?
Yeah, it's that area, that coastal area, is where the majority of China's population is, and that southeastern Asia just area in general tends to they're more behind on like pollution control and things like that. And
Right.
I'm not going to get political as far as that's concerned, but just factually, their pollution control and their concern for things like that are fairly minimal
There's a
compared to
variety
the
of things
yeah.
that kind of happen here. So there's a lot of, textile pollution with dyes and things, farming pollution with fertilizers, a whole bunch, and human waste from the cities and towns that are along the banks of this river, that kind of play a factor into um, why there's so few individuals left.
Mhm.
So as we see in the threats department here, a lot of climate change, droughts, frequent periods of drought and frequent periods of storms and flooding don't exactly do anything in nature very well because they're
No,
not used to such rapid changes
yeah.
for prolonged periods of time. Um, a lot of the Yangtze River has been turned into uh, hydroelectric dams. There's a lot of those along the river, so that kind of messes with the flow of the river itself,
Mm.
and maybe that interferes with um, the food availability for these creatures.
Yeah, it
Um,
doesn't allow things to wash downstream the way they did in the past,
right,
as
as
well
well
as
as
limiting water flow downstream. Period.
right. And there's a variety of other things, mining waste drain, like mining drainage, uh, aquaculture. People use them as food. Eastern medicine is big into using animals for food. Shark fin soup, turtle soup. things like that. And they're luckily they don't use them in the pet trade. If they use this in the pet trade, I'd say that all hope was lost.
Yeah, I mean there'd be more of them, but it would be bad still.
Right. Um, Honestly, there's not much we can do to help. As I said, there's three wild species left, possibly two, and there's only a couple in captivity, and the one male that's on record in captivity is unable to reproduce. So there's no real way for us to get new a new population because there's no way for them to reproduce. Like we said, that's a key part of life earlier in the episode.
Yeah, and look, reading the at the bottom there, the conservation actions in detail. It seems like they've tried artificial insemination, but they were been unsuccessful. That was back in 2015, so it's not looking good for this turtle species by any means.
Right. So that's our amazing species of today. Um, we're going to go on into our final segment of the day. That's where we're going to talk about the opposite end of the spectrum per se, the invasive species. We haven't really coined a name for this segment yet. Uh, Behind enemy lines, nature's most wanted,
Yeah,
something along those lines, where it's
yeah,
just a nasty species that can make its home basically anywhere.
yeah. So an invasive species is a non-native species that in a foreign ecosystem, foreign being like its non-native ecosystem that is able to cause kind of not just environmental harm, but as well as economic harm and sometimes even to human health as well. So like that environmental harm could be because it's not native there. It doesn't have the native controls that it does where it's supposed to be. So the species we're going to talk about this week is from southeastern Asia as well. It's called the tree of heaven. Um, is Alanthus altissima is the scientific name. It's a lot of times referred to as Alanthus. It is obviously a tree native to the southeastern part of the Asian continent. It grows really, really fast. In America, it looks similar to the native walnut trees, and as far as the leaves are concerned, but the leaves tend to be um, kind of they're colored a little more differently, like especially on the younger trees. Some of the really newer leaves have a purple color to them. Um,
I'm
where
sorry, Alex. Did you give the common name for this yet?
Yeah, the tree of heaven.
Tree of Heaven.
Yes, yeah. So yes, I mean they grow very quickly. I've seen them like being in the vegetation management field. We see a lot of this growing in utility right of ways. It grows incredibly fast. It spreads incredibly fast. I've seen them in just a couple years. I've seen bare ground grow up to uh, saplings that are 6, 10, 15 feet tall. Like they grow incredibly quickly in a short amount of time. But as far as trees are concerned, that tall in a couple years is ridiculously fast. And they can get up to 80 foot tall or so. So they get fairly large, 6 foot in diameter, which is a very big tree. I'm sure that's more some of the more native
Um,
species.
I'm seeing an article here, or more like a pamphlet actually, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture,
Okay,
um, published by the Forest Service. So it's a legitimate
it's a
pamphlet here
reputable.
from September 2014, and they say that this tree of heaven can grow between 10 to 15 feet in 1 year.
Okay, yeah, that would make sense just from my own experience with it, um, as it says it's a fast growing tree. That absolutely makes sense. So going through just a little more, I'll pull up. I'm using off of the Penn State Extension, which is Penn State University in Pennsylvania. They have a very big agricultural like school. They're very big into that. So it's in Pennsylvania, where we're from, is considered invasive as well as a noxious weed, which is a kind of a higher classification, saying it's gotten to the point where it's like a kill on site kind of thing. Like if you have it on your property, you want to get rid of it. Um, as quickly as possible, especially before it seeds. So this is kind of what I'm talking about, that purplish color on your younger leaves. It's got kind of like a smooth looking bark. So coming through some of the descriptions here, kind of that smooth, like a greener, grayish bark. That's a good resemblance to like if you're familiar with like a cantaloupe, like the melon. Similar sort of, as much smoother as it's younger. It's actually got those young branches have they're kind of fuzzy actually. They've got little hairs on them. Um, I'm not sure if you can see that, and you can see this in this picture here. This twig here has some. Now that's part of the leaflet, um, but that fuzzy look as well as the main branches have that fuzzy kind of
Right, and
hairs
that
on it.
that fuzz isn't necessarily uncommon for
No, no
younger
trees.
younger plants to have.
Correct. They do that as kind of a moisture control. It helps keep water closer to the surface. So this is those leaflets I was talking about. They look like similar like the native walnut trees or sumac trees, which are somewhat invasive in Pennsylvania, but not the way that the tree of heaven is. To growing different things. These the twigs are kind of that greenish color. Have that dark brown coloration inside of it. Have very large, pronounced leaf, like the bud scale scars on the twigs right here. You can see that's a good way to identify when there's not leaves on the tree, like in the winter time when there's no leaves on the tree. They're very pronounced. Someone I know actually said they kind of look the ends of them kind of look like hot dogs. The end of those twigs, which because
I
they have
see it.
that darker coloration. Yeah, it's you can see it there. So then these are what your seeds look like. They're called samara. It's a wing kind of seed, so that's why they're as
Kind of like a
well.
maple seed,
Yeah, like a maple, like if you call them like the little
the
helicopters or
helicopter,
whirlybirds,
right?
whatever you call them. And that's also why they spread so readily and so far is because you see one tree can produce hundreds of seeds, and they just spread so readily. Um, and apparently, I suppose here, as it says, I guess the trees are uh, dioecious, I believe, or monoecious. Which way is that? They only have
Dioecious.
dioecious, so they have separate male and female trees. It appears. Um, yeah, and so looking, you see that your lookalikes like your staghorn sumac, walnut, hickory. I could maybe a young hickory. I could see, especially if it's a like a butternut or like um, those that are smooth. A shagbark hickory looks nothing like a tree of
Like,
heaven. Maybe
yeah.
if you're
Now,
so, but definitely the sumac and the walnut. But the one thing here, it did say the leaflet. So that's each of these individual little leaves on here is a leaflet, and then this whole thing is your leaf technically. Those leaflets have a smooth edge on the tree of heaven, while the native trees have uh, little serration teeth
well,
on them, which
yeah.
is something that I'd actually just recently learned while studying for this. And then as well, yeah, here we go, dioecious. So there's male or female, but it does grow. Um, I believe it can sprout back from, um, like it does basal sprouting, like root sprouting. So you can get clones of trees as well as uh, trees that are produced from seed. And it says sprouts as young as 2 years old are able to produce seeds, and they produce what are called allelopathic chemicals that uh, prevent other plants from being able to grow around them. So you can see this is actually something I've seen in a couple cases. This is just super dense. Every single one of these is a tree of heaven sapling. You can see each
Right.
individual little stem
And
here.
we'll talk about what allelopathy is when we cross that bridge.
Yeah.
Not exactly seen in the animal kingdom, like how we're going to talk about that first. More or less plants, but the basic rundown is they secrete chemicals in the root system that kind of interfere with the growth patterns and growth uh, of other plants in the area. And with something in terms of a tree of heaven, since they're invasive, our native plants haven't exactly found a way around it, or just have a resistance to that allelopathy.
Yeah, and there's no like animals or anything or that consume them, or there's no real pests on them because it's not its native range. So that's why it's growing the way it is, because it doesn't have those pests or consumers that eat the tree. Now, another invasive species that we might talk about next time, the spotted lanternfly, is a from same area in Asia, where it actually does partially consume the tree of heaven, but of course, without having any sort of predators, it's become invasive as well over the last few years, especially, and that's something we've mostly seen here on the eastern coast of the United States. I don't know if it's quite on the west coast yet. Um,
I don't
I
believe so,
haven't
but
looked
I think its
lately.
range spreads each and every year.
It has been spreading so very rapidly. It started like on the coast, in the eastern, like Philadelphia, Maryland, kind of like Baltimore, those coastal cities, and has now spread across the entire state of Pennsylvania, which is 500 miles in what, 5 years, 10,
Yeah,
5 to 10
that's
years.
astronomical.
Yeah, it's super super fast, and it's again the port. Unfortunately, there's not going to really be a way to stop it at this point. It's just
Right. So
so
the U.S. Department of
crazy.
Forestry tables on different things they're willing to do for biological and chemical control agents
Mm,
for um, the Tree of Heaven.
yeah.
So we'll talk about the biological ones first.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, there's larger mammals, mostly ungulates, that are able to graze on the Tree of Heaven. Although it's not exactly preferred because it's not native, the animals aren't used to it.
Yeah.
But there has been cases where uh, the deer in the area will graze on the leaves, um, and under extreme grazing pressure, some livestock will as well.
Hmm.
But it's not exactly the most uh,
Preferable.
useful
Yeah, I think
thing.
it
It's not
said
preferred.
in that leaf section, or that look-alike section, said the leaves of the tree of heaven create a foul odor when crushed and when the twigs are broken. So I'm sure that probably also
Yeah,
leads
that
to
kind
a
of turns
bad
them off a
taste.
little bit from it.
Yeah.
But they have been doing research on what looks like six different things on the
Hmm.
biological side, and as to because the thing with a biological agent is, especially if we're trying to get rid of an invasive species, is a lot of the time you have to bring something else in to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So, and
It
we want to make
gets
sure we
into
can
a
control
slippery
that
slope. Yeah.
before that gets out of hand too. So we're trying out these six things. The first three are all fungal pathogens. Um, However, so far it looks like we're not having a lot of success because
Hmm.
this was an article published in 2014. So obviously things have changed since then. We'll try to find newer articles with the most up to date and current information as we proceed. Um, but so the first fungus they tested sticks around in the soil for about 10 years after the fact,
Mm.
uh, which isn't exactly great. Uh,
No, not if you're trying to use it to just get rid of the tree of heaven, and then it's like done just to keep it from
yeah,
affecting
you want something
the
that's a quick
neighboring.
one and done.
Yeah.
Once the tree's gone, your agent is gone too.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Uh,
that's why I mentioned earlier I'm a certified pesticide applicator. Um, a lot of what we do for vegetation management is your chemical controls, which I'm sure is what you're going to next.
Correct.
Um, which using herbicides to applied to the trees. That's mostly in your summer months, so like June through September, when leaf out has occurred. Well, you do a foliar application, which is there's different methods for that. Mainly, it's either high volume or low volume, is what we call it. High volumes, like the big spray trucks, using the pumps off of the trucks, the long hoses, spraying it super far into the air to try to, like that picture I showed, um, from the Penn State site. That super dense area. It's the most effective way to try to get control there, because they're just so dense. There's so much of it. Dense area, when you've thinned out the amount of tree of heaven that's on the site. Using more of a low volume, which is like the backpack sprayers, to help that, and then as well, it's called a hack and squirt, which I think is one of the most effective methods for the tree control, but it's more labor intensive. Where you take like a hatchet or a machete, you cut into the bark near the base of the tree, like a 6 to 12 inches, like, was that, like a foot, or like 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters off the
Right.
ground. You cut downward, not the whole way around, so that it just peels like all the bark. You leave some spots where the um, transportation tissue is still able to flow up and down, and then you apply using like just a little spray bottle, a slightly more concentrated mixture into those cuts. It just kind of cups it right there, and that herbicide sits in those cuts, and it's transported through the plant systems and it kills the plant up and down up to the shoot, roots to shoots kind of thing. But as I said, it's much more difficult to do, but it's super effective as well as you don't get the concern of overspray when you get your foliar applications where you're spraying it, which usually you're using lower concentrations because you're applying it over a much broader area. There's the thing with pesticides in general, where that you're only allowed to apply so much to a certain area, um, which as long as that's followed, it kind of minimizes your damage around your non-target damage, which throughout history, those who've kind of studied some uh, scientific history uh, is what caused problems. We may talk about DDT at some point, which is a pesticide used for mosquitoes, I think specifically, which it's still used a little bit in the
Developing countries.
tropical regions. Um, but the overuse of that led to problems. It because DDT bioaccumulators, which means in that trophic pyramid, as it moves up, it concentrates more and more. So while it
Right.
would be in the mosquito, your frog would eat it, and it would have a little bit, wouldn't affect it too much, but then it would get up to your hawks and things, your eagles, it especially affected the birds, or the really large fish that would eat, like the smaller fish that
Right.
ate mosquitoes and mosquito larvae. Um,
And
it
we'll go into this more
concentrated.
in depth too
Yeah.
when we get to maybe some of these amazing species we'll cover are probably going to be some type of avian species
Yes.
that was really heavily affected. You know, the bald eagle, prime example. Maybe one, down the line we'll talk about that in an amazing species segment. But I'll continue on with these biological agents, and as Alex said, I am going to continue into these chemical agents.
Mm.
So they tried 3 funguses, not really much as of the time of this article being published, not much success with them. They're all being researched, um, along with a species of webworm, which I'm assuming is kind of like the tent worms that we have around the area,
Probably something similar to that. We'd
like
have
a
to look.
caterpillar type
Yeah.
insect that is able to generate a silky-like substance to kind of create its nests in.
Mhm.
And
That'd be my guess. I don't
I'd
know.
assume that this one, the what's the scientific name? The Atlantis.
Correct. Yeah, Atlantis altissimo is
Yeah,
the name.
this is the Atlantis webworm. So I'm assuming
Mhm.
it's favors that selectively feeds on male tree of heaven plants.
Okay.
Granted, that doesn't exactly help with the female plants,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, and that clonal production from root development.
right. Um, and there's 2 species of beetles that lay their eggs in the phloem, which is one of those transportation structures inside of trees and other plants. That
Mhm.
the xylem and the phloem are the 2 transportation ones. One takes
Correct.
water and the other takes nutrients.
Correct. Yeah, that's your cambium tissue. I think was it the xylem transports up and the phloem transports down, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
Um,
I believe you're right there too.
yeah, so
Um,
it's not so much they just do water, just do nutrients. It's more of an up and down like the xylem,
right,
and that's it's the way those tissues are made in the plants, and that's we'll get way more in depth into that when we get to the talking about the plants for sure.
right. So that what they're trying to do is both these weevil species lay their eggs in the phloem, and uh, they're trying to see if you can kind of use these in tandem, where you use a beetle and it lays eggs in the phloem, kind of screws up the tree there a little bit. But if you can also use the the fungal pathogens, because they're used to stop the flow of water and nutrients in the area that they affect.
Yeah, okay, because the fungus like grows into the cambium tissue.
Right.
Okay.
So that could kill a part to all of the tree, um, which would be obviously the most beneficial versus the worms that feed only on the leaves of the plants. But this is all, more research was needed at the time of this article. I'll have to
Hmm.
double check and see how much has gotten accomplished since then. But I'd assume,
Yeah, and of course things like that with trees, it tends to take a long term
right,
because of just the nature of the organism. They live long.
right. So we'll go into the more chemical testing they use, as Alex was talking about the foliar spraying. Um, Obviously, glyphosate top of the list. That's one of the more common pesticides, at least in
Yeah.
America, that we have.
Yeah, it's a broad spectrum herbicide. So it controls a lot of different plant species for sure, and that's like I said that. And usually, when doing, especially when you're doing for something like an invasive species, you use a mixture of herbicides. So a lot of what we use is a mixture of glyphosate and imazapyr, which is that
Which is the
next one
second on this
down.
list, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's some of that more non-selective herbicide, but they function in different ways, and that's something as the listeners want to look on their own, kind of look and see how they work differently. They target different plant processes in different ways, and that's how they're that mixture you get when you get specific species or plants or specific individuals in that the tree of heaven species that may be more resistant to glyphosate. You get the imazapyr, and that usually helps kind of carry over the edge, so you get that better control. um, and then the other ones you said they're the aminocyclopyrrolide, which is kind of uh, similar to imazapyr. It looks like
Right. And it's
there's like a combination. It looks like there's a couple of different
there's,
chemicals
it's
that
it's
are
also a
together.
non-selective herbicide,
Yeah.
um, but it also has that same issue of overspray hurting the other plants in there that you don't exactly want to hurt.
Yeah, and that comes with that broad spectrum, like non-selective herbicide. That's where you have to be careful when you're looking in the areas that you're applying those to prevent that overspray. Only applying it to where you want to, not where you don't.
Right.
And then it looks like the
Uh,
last two are actually more selective. They're like seem like woody species, plant species selective, I think.
Yeah, they do the more woody, trees and shrubs. It won't hurt your grass. Some of the more fragile, we'll say,
Yeah.
uh, plant species.
Hmm.
But yeah, they pretty much all do the same thing in terms of chemical control. Spray it over top or spray it. Do what Alex was saying with this hack and spray
Hmm.
method. But they all pretty much work rather similarly. And that's the article that I have for the Tree of Heaven.
Yeah. So just kind of looking for that, especially if the listeners are in the United States. Even I don't know if at least that's what we're most familiar with is that especially the eastern United States. If you see it, um, do your best to get rid of it because it
Right.
can very quickly take over, especially if you have a wooded area or like a wet area. Um, it will just fill in super fast and just push out all your native species, and they don't look that great, and like I said, they get big, but they don't live that long. Like they live less than 100 years typically,
Right.
if I remember correctly, which comparatively to most native broadleaf trees in the United States is like a young as like a baby tree. Most of like our oaks, maples, they live like 200 years is pretty
Average.
for oaks. They tend to live longer, especially like your whites and your red oaks.
Right.
They can live upwards of 300-400 years. But like your
Uh,
maples, you're over 100, like to 150.
and it's better to catch the Tree of Heaven earlier on in its life
Correct.
cycle, when it's a young seedling, because that's the easiest way to get a manual uh, extraction from the roots and all. Once
Hmm.
once it gets to that like that 10 foot tall, Like Alex was saying, it's really hard to do anything other than a chemical.
Yeah, unless you if you mow it like a lot, like with a brush hog, or you cut it for a couple years in a row, eventually you'll kill it. But like I said, it doesn't. You have to keep on it for a few years in a row, prevent the seeds from growing up, kind of force the roots to use all the stored energy that they have over those couple years. Like it's just, it takes time and a lot more effort to do it that way.
Right, and it's this article also explains that probably one of the worst things you can do to stop the spread is actually a controlled burn. A lot of
Mhm.
times we use a controlled burn to get rid of a lot of one pest in one area, or uh,
Especially vegetation.
yeah, especially vegetation. Um, in this case, Tree of Heaven is able to go through prolific sprouting during
Oh,
a
I
fire
bet.
stress. So therefore, just doing this controlled burn, it actually makes more of them pop up. Basically, you
Hmm.
might get rid of two. It's like a hydra
Yeah.
from like mythology. You chop off one head and six more come up.
Yeah, same like that. Just that cutting it. If you don't um, treat the stump after you cut it, a lot of times it'll sprout back with just a vengeance, like a hydra from mythology. Just it's ridiculous how quickly and voraciously they will sprout back.
Right. So that's all we have really for today's episode.
Yeah.
We'll recap. We covered what makes something a biotic or living organism.
Hmm.
Once again, you need your 5 points of life.
Yeah.
You need some type of cell. You need energy. You need to be able to respond to your stimuli. I'm not sure if we talked what a stimuli is, but that's really anything from like getting the light shown on you to needing to eat. Feeling hunger,
Yeah.
and anything like those are more internal things.
Yeah.
External stimuli could be something like
Temperature
temperature
changes,
change,
moisture
predators.
changes, predators. Yeah.
Um, you need to be able to grow and reproduce.
You get
Eat and
bigger.
bang.
Yeah, put it bluntly. Yes, you
Yeah,
have to be able, yeah, grow, get bigger, and make more.
right. And lastly, you need to maintain your own stable environment because if you're not able to do that, things go haywire, and you know you're better off being normal
Yeah,
inside.
yeah, kind of what, yeah, you like whatever that normal for your body or whatever that animal's or organism's body is. Yeah, and
Right.
then we did a quick run through of the classifications of living things. Of course, your super kingdoms or your domains, how you learned it, and then the many kingdoms, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. As we go through the taxonomic tree, those are our big kind of learning points today. And then, of course, our amazing species, the Yangtze giant soft-shelled turtle, Rhophitus swinhoi, and then the
And then our
invasive species for
invasive
the,
species of the week, the tree of heaven, as we
yeah,
went into great detail about, we'll say.
yeah, yeah,
But that's
yeah,
only because it's such a prevalent organism in our area.
yes,
But I
absolutely,
think that's going to do it for this week, and
yeah,
I hope you guys
absolutely,
join us next week as we talk about sponges, right?
yeah. I think that's what we're
Porifera,
gonna start with sponges. Yeah, so that'd be the,
uh,
is that the family? No, it's not the
phylum,
family. The
phylum,
phylum. The
phylum
phylum.
porifera.
Yeah, so your sponges, which is a lot of your sea sponges, especially.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. Well, Tyler, thank you very much,
Thank
and
you. Thank you for joining
absolutely,
me,
yeah,
and I will see
absolutely,
you all next week.
yeah, absolutely. Learn something.